Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm joined with David Kirkpatrick. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. It's a little rainy, stormy. It's been like that the past few days. Nice sun shining, then all of a sudden a big storm comes rolling through, blows your trees down. But it happens.
Par for the course this year, I think.
Yeah. It's we are recording this in July of 2023, so you may be listening to this at some other point. And if it's your Kentucky weather, who knows what you're getting? So we'll move on. We got some good stuff. We've been talking a little bit about what we're calling the new Republic of Kentucky. You know, Kentucky's been a state. Things are getting settled. However, this is kind of a limbo, if you want to say the limbo episode, where we're actually going to be talking about the last Native American raid in Kentucky, or what is called the last Native American raid in Kentucky. We'll get to it a little bit, but this is the story of Morgan Station. Pretty interesting history.
Absolutely.
And again, to bridge that gap of frontiersmen, this happens in 1793, so become a state, but we're still in that hybrid statehood. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, there's a shift. You're going to find the odd attack here and there, but as far as significant attacks of lots of warriors and the threat of Indian attack being on the minds of everyone, that's kind of fading away. And you're right, it's not the 1850s or something. A lot of times people will jump straight from the American Revolution to the Civil War. This is not that period. But at the same time, the days of Harrod and Boone and Logan are kind of fading, and you've got actual towns and stagecoach routes, all those things.
Yeah, and we talked about this back in the year days there. Those first early settlements, you got Boonesboro, Logan Station, Harrod, and those were Boonesboro was the northern spot. You get Bryan Station and some other places coming in that are a little higher northern, and so the attacks kind of lessen because those inner places are kind of protected more. Well, same thing applies here. You're just kind of pushing it a little further north. More stations are coming in. So Boonesboro was probably a pretty safe place at this time. Barring any kind of little attack here or there, the station is getting safer. Because that northern boundary is kind of pushing up, or northern settlements are pushing up. So therefore, it's a bit harder for a Shawnee group or whatever to get past those alarm centers. If they're going to attack somebody, they're going to only attack people on that northern part, because if they don't, they might be discovered and so forth. Many things can happen, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit too as we kind of talk about Morgan Station. Anyway, that's a good summary overview. Let's dive into it.
Good.
So Morgan Station is located in what is now Montgomery County, but at the time, counties changing. Montgomery, Bath. It's been in a few different counties over the decades or centuries, however you want to say it. But in present day, Montgomery County is where you would find it, and it was established or planned by Ralph Morgan, and he kind of came from a high status, probably more than most frontiersmen. He had a bit of wealth backing him up, and he kind of came to Kentucky seeking that fortune. He actually arrived in Boonesboro in 1779. His father, William Montgomery, um, came with him, and he was a gentry of Virginia status,
Absolutely.
which, like many of us gentries around, uh, you know, we hold our noses high.
Absolutely.
uh, but 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 anyway, typical story in some, uh, well, I say that, but I kind of reminds me of William Whitley. Kind of had some high status in Virginia, not maybe as high as the Morgans, but came over to Kentucky, was just seeking that extra fortune, I guess, if you want to say it like that way. But Ralph was actually pretty young when he arrived in Kentucky. Well, not too young, 21 years old, and he went out with the other men and scouted lands around Boonesboro and kind of learned the trade of surveying and surviving in the frontier, I guess the frontier of Kentucky. Morgan had joined uh, John Bowman's campaign against the Shawnee into the Ohio region, and that was kind of one of his big taste of battle as he's kind of growing as well. And Colonel Michael Bettinger recalled a moment of battle where he had kind of sounded the retreat, and upon the retreat, he saw Morgan behind a tree taking on enemy fire, and he yelled at him, saying that he was exposed and was fighting on his own hook, which I don't exactly know what that means. Fighting on your own hook. Would that mean you're caught in a trap?
Yeah, so yeah, I don't 100% understand that either. I get the gist of it, but I don't know the origin of that phrase. I'll have to dig that out.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of is he'd caught himself in a trap.
Right.
I guess if you're fighting on your own hook, maybe I don't know. Anyway, maybe somebody out there will know um, some info that can clarify that for us. But Morgan ended up retreating with the rest of the men and got out of there okay. Um, but what kind of started as a trickle, and we kind of talked about this of people coming into Kentucky, really became a flood. People were coming in. More stations were being built. The Strahd station was built by John Strahd, and Morgan soon moved to join the men there. So you're just getting this steady progress of people moving out, spreading out. Morgan was given a land grant, and in 1785, he marries Mary Douglas, who was the widow of John Douglas, who had died in the Battle of Blue Licks. And Mary was also a Bryan and was related to Rebecca Boone. So we got to get our Daniel Boone connection.
That's
Rebecca
right.
Boone is Daniel Boone's wife. So check that off the list. um, so Morgan became the deputy surveyor of Fayette County. And while he's surveying, and I always find this fascinating, while he's surveying, he goes ahead and surveys himself about 35,000 acres.
Nice little
Little
piece of
bit of
land.
a, yeah, for your work,
Yeah.
um, and this changed big time when there was a discovery of iron ore deposits nearby, which plays into the next fella who kind of has something to do with this whole um, Morgan Station and so forth.
Yeah, and talking about that, that would be Jacob Myers, of course, who's an entrepreneur. He helps provide wire to the colonies during the Revolutionary War. He heads out to Kentucky, like a lot of these guys, to check out the land there and seek out opportunities. He's part of a surveying group with Arthur Fox, who's the founder of Washington. And that's not Washington County, but that's Washington, the little settlement in what's now Mason County. But
Mhm.
while surveying, he asked them to survey a little land for him, and they refused. And so he then questions their surveying land for themselves. So he's questioning their motives, and they laugh at him. He couldn't read or write, but during the night he woke up and he walked all the way to Harrodsburg, and that's a drive even today. Heading southwards, you can imagine the walk. He turned in the survey 30 minutes before Arthur and his party arrived, and he was granted the land. So even in those early days, there's a dispute, and but he gets the upper hand because, despite the limited education, he's willing to put in the work. Uh,
Mhm.
that's the start of something big because he gains a lot of land over the years. He eventually settles on what's known as the hanging fork of the Dix River in Lincoln County, and he became known as the first of everything in Kentucky. I mean, he starts a paper mill. He starts a furnace. I mean, all sorts of businesses and the types of things, again, that maybe you didn't need when you're living in a fort, but now that towns are developing, you do need in Kentucky. So by the time he's done collecting land, he's got a total of 185,000 acres. So if you're wondering, that's about the size of Fayette County today. So um, pretty impressive.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of land. I mean, I cannot imagine, especially in the times before combustion engines and stuff, what you do with that much land. He finds iron deposits, and he kind of wanted to make a town around them, make a prosperous settlement around those deposits. So he advertises in the Kentucky Gazette, which is the Lexington newspaper of the day, and offered 20,000 acres of land at $30 per 100 acres. So that's a pretty good rate.
Mhm.
But Morgan and Myers had known each other since 1783, so Morgan would end up receiving his 5,000 acres, where Morgan Station would end up being built uh, a little while later from Myers. So that's
Yeah.
that connection.
Yeah, and, when you're kinda thinking about a station or settling land, it seems like, there are kind of 2 ways to go to go about it. Man goes to the land and begins building a settlement, example, kinda like Benjamin Logan, or a man sends a group of men to build and settle the land, and once that is done, he comes to the area. And that's how Ralph Morgan did it. He pretty much hired some people, a group of men, Tom Montgomery, Cy Hart, George Naylor, Robert Daugherty, James Douglas, John Holmes, and Peter and William Hands. And pretty much sends them out to go clear some land, plant some corn, and build the station. Some of these men came from Dix River, which is the area that's kind of connected to the Jacob Myers, and most of these men were Revolutionary War vets and would become prominent in other areas throughout the state. Um, but that's kind of the again shows of maybe a bit more of Morgan's wealth, that he's able to hire these people and so forth. They settled on a piece of land on the Slate Creek, and it was very well located. It is set on a bluff that's called Harper's Ridge now, and the side of the station was very well defended with the setting of the ridge on one side, the position of the creek on the other, and the men cleared the land and built some cabins. They built 3 cabins, placing one on each corner, making a rectangle. However, they didn't build the stockades; they just built the cabins. They didn't really set it up as a fort per se or a complete station. And then they went to plant their corn and planned to return in June. They met back at Stroud Station, where William Morgan was presiding at, and made the journey back to Morgan Station. However, when they had returned, they found out that all their corn had been destroyed by turkeys, and they planted another crop of corn, but they did not build the stockade again for the station. So, you know, a long process. It seems like this is kind of taken. So, you know, pretty interesting, but they're
Yeah,
getting there.
absolutely. And I'd like to think in my head that I'm going to be the adventurous guy who comes out here by himself and finds his
That's
own
right.
land. However, given the option, I think I probably
Yeah,
would have sent somebody.
that's
Uh,
right.
so I can't criticize him too much. But that takes us to Peter Harper, who begins building his station shortly after Morgan Station was started. And it's amazing how many of these little stations all pop up around the same time. He's only 4 miles to the west, which by foot is a good hike, but not too terribly far if you need help. And Harper's Creek is located nearby that. So Harper is actually half Shawnee. His mother had been captured while she was living in Virginia, and she was wed to a Shawnee man, and she had Peter himself. So eventually, there was a prisoner exchange, um, and Peter and his mother were returned to Virginia. So Harper and his brother John came to Boonesboro and were given land while they were there. They hadn't settled on it because of its location and its exposure to the frontier. Um, with Morgan building his station, it pushed the edge of the frontier a little farther away, and that made it a bit more comfortable for them.
Mhm.
Uh, Harper and his nephew George build the cabin, and they begin raising crops. And like you said earlier, the first thing you do is get a roof over your head, and the very next thing you do is start planting, because without it, you've got no food to live on. So
Mhm.
there's a big difference between Harper and Morgan. Um, and that was because Harper was willing to stay in his cabin and tend his crops, and he's kind of looking
Mhm.
over it. So
Yeah,
you don't
and
have to worry.
yeah, well, and that's a good example of the 2 different, avenues. One guy's out here planting his doing his, staying, developing his land. The other guy sent some other people to do it, and that's fine. That's all. But I had mentioned, I mentioned, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but if, people are interested in this book. Oh, getting a little glare there. It's In Search of Morgan Station and the Last Indian Raid in Kentucky by Harry Enoch. Very good book. I know I was talking to you earlier about how detailed and just so much more information is given about this raid, this time period. Um, again, this limbo time of Kentucky's becoming a state. The frontier is kind of dying. But a lot of information, a lot of good information, a lot of good sources, which we'll read a bit. Good maps too. There was a few good maps in there, and you were talking about all these stations popping up. Um,
Yeah,
and 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 even when this raid happens, Morgan Station is just about surrounded. Like it's not on the edge. It's kind of interesting that how it takes place and so forth. But anyway, we'll continue on a little bit. Kind of the next little bit here, we kind of see the purpose of all this and why all this is kind of happening on the front on the pioneer side of it or the
yeah,
settler side.
absolutely. Laying that foundation, because in 1789, Morgan Station is still unoccupied. So Morgan was actually searching for people to tend it and take care of it and preserve it. Jacob Myers is down the road. He's starting his ironworks, which in itself is a fairly ambitious endeavor. It's pretty crazy to think about. It's hard under any circumstances without modern equipment, but
Mhm.
especially in Kentucky, you got to have a road that leads to the area. You've got to build a quarry. You've got to remove and cut stone. You've got to clear the site. You've got to erect the furnaces and other structures that you need to get it hot enough to extract that. You've got to build fortifications. You've got to have to protect people. You got to have residences for your workers to go home to at night. And then once you've done all of that, you've got it set up. The wood has to be cut. It has to be hauled. It has to be converted to charcoal and stored. Iron ore has to be dug out and transported and cleaned and stored. And again, the earth by itself is not light, as anyone who's ever wielded a shovel knows, much less when it's got these trace amounts of metal in it. But the furnace has to be charged and lit and tended day and night by the iron master. You've got to keep that consistent temperature. And, you know, the heat was trapped once a day. Molten iron is channeled into casting houses, and then trenches are formed for the pig iron to go into the clay molds for kettles and plowshares and things like that. So then you had whatever's left over. You always have waste that has to be removed far enough away from the site. And this has to happen over and over and over again for this to be successful. So, if living on the frontier as a farmer sounded hard to you, ironworking, especially in the 1790s, is a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about all of that, all the stuff that had to be done, I guess, in order to make that. And they're in the middle of the wilderness. There's not like there's a road or anything. There's nothing. And Myers is kind of wanting to start this, but Myers was very familiar with this process in Maryland. But Maryland in 1789 is different than Kentucky in 1789. You know, this is the straight up wilderness. But he had some ambition, and his plan was to get it done one way or the other. But Andrew Hood was hired to kind of build the road. George Naylor, his family, and Jeremiah Poor from Lincoln County moved into the cabins. Then more workers were hired to begin digging out the iron ore. James Ward, John Tyree, is that Tyree?
I'd say tire, like you said,
Uh,
but in
yeah.
Kentucky, names are pronounced so many different ways.
Uh, Solomon Skaggs were some of the first workers hired to do a month's work. Um, so the bourbon furnace, this would have been the first in the West, I believe, and it was actually owned, or I shouldn't say owned, but maybe financed and supported by Christopher Greenup. So another
Yeah,
uh,
familiar name.
Yeah, big name coming in there. But obviously, it was very hard to get employees because of the threat of attacks and so forth. Militia would be stationed eventually at the ironworks as well to protect all of the workers and so forth. Um, by 1790, Morgan Station was left alone by the Native Americans, but encounters were still taking place. Um, and you know, John Wade, which we'll talk about a little more, he recalls running into some Native Americans by accident and so forth, just out in the wilderness. This was still happening. Kentucky's The big issue was Kentucky's game was running out. When Daniel Boone and all them showed up, the big talk was, oh, there's so much game, all these animals and stuff to hunt, and it's just the land is so rich and fertile. Well, everybody runs over into the state and starts taking care of this, hunting and trying to get these um, supplies or whatever. And so, in some cases they were wasteful as well. But numerous of settlers were killing and kind of just driving out the game: buffalo, elk, turkey, all that kind of stuff. So that could be a little bit of the issue as well, of the pending attacks and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got these clashes over the same resources with Native Americans as well. So in 1789, there are a few incidences there that have to be considered. First, you have the death of Peter Harper. He went hunting, killed a deer. The next day, he went back hunting again, trying to make lightning strike twice, and he never returns. And people wondered what happened to him. He had told James Wade that he was going to get pine cones for his mother, and later his horse was found with the pine cones in a pouch, but with blood on the saddle. So indicating probably a native attack. James McMillan was also heard talking about him killing a Native American the same day that Harper went missing. So we know there is some native presence in the area, and the blood on the saddle certainly speaks of violence. This caused speculation about what happened to him. James said he didn't kill Harper, and he knew it was a native. But these early days, as we saw with Herod and so many other people, Kentucky's a wild and woolly place. From 1790 to 1792, Native American attacks continued, but Morgan Station is pretty much left alone due to the militia near the ironworks. As you said, it's not really on the periphery of Kentucky at this point. It's kind of in the middle. And at one point during this period, the settlement or the area was even abandoned due to fear of attacks. But you've got that tension built up there, but you're just not seeing it materialize, even though it's on the back burner in everyone's minds. 1791. Morgan Station is surrounded by quite a few forts. You've got Cassidy's, Anderson's, Montgomery's, Smith's, Baker's, Troutman's, and others. And again, these places are popping up left and right. The Sundering forts protecting Morgan's fort in a way by encasing it, but these first few were really not that close. It'd be impossible to sneak an army in. But a small group of raiders, warriors, they could still slide by. So I don't mean to suggest that that's the case, that it's completely isolated, but there is some level of protection there. Interestingly enough, though, Ralph Morgan still did not live at the station. So it's been a while now that it's been established. But at one point, the native presence in the area around the station spooked the handful of men who were there. And so they finally began improving the structures for defense. You talked earlier how they planted the corn and things, and they never got around to the walls. This incident finally leads them to do that. So they're adding blockhouses, and they've changed the roof. And all this is going on again in 1792 when Kentucky becomes a state. So you have, on the one hand, a bit of isolation, or insulation rather, a bit of protection. But at the same time, there's enough fear there that people just aren't willing to risk it. A lot of improvements happened to the area, but little mountain town, Mount Sterling, was beginning to thrive, and it became kind of the hub in the area, and so it's drawing people that way. Clark County gets established, and Mount Sterling was the first town in that county. So for the year 1792, despite all this, Morgan Station remains pretty well protected and unbothered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good for the people there, and it just shows the growth of the frontier. How things are kind of going one way and so forth. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.